Please welcome back Petra Epperlein and Michael Tucker. All right. So naturally, I'd like to begin by asking you two to discuss the genesis of the film, following the previous films concerning Iraq. How did this film come about, I suppose?
So we started thinking about the story many years ago. I actually started working on a graphic novel about the story like 7 years ago, and realized it's not really a graphic novel. Also, the story obviously has been with me for like most of my life. And 2 years ago, we decided to turn it into a film. So we started testing basically my family to figure out if this all works. The other aspect in the film obviously is the access to the files in the Stasi Archive. In 2012, I believe, was the first time when I asked for my files and my father's files in the archive, and only last summer we actually got the files. So it's a really long, drawn-out process, but now finally we have a film.
And I think in viewing the film, one can see where there might be myriad challenges along the way, whether they be logistical, emotional, and so on. Could you talk a bit about things that you found challenging in the course of making the film?
Well, obviously there are many challenging things in it. The story of my father's suicide in itself was like emotionally very, I don't know what the word is. I personally had to have some distance to the story in time to be able to talk about it, so that my family, and I had to convince them that they should actually talk about it on camera. And then, yes, again, the Stasi Archive was the other challenge.
But the big question looming was no one knew what the answer would be. So that probably posed the biggest challenge. I mean, had he been an informant or had he worked for the Stasi, the outcome would have been vastly different with her family.
Yeah, so we actually started filming before we knew what we would find in the archives. So yes, as Michael says, if we would have found out that my father would have been an informant for the Stasi, that I don't even know.
And then there's another funny thing that actually exists in the Stasi archives, is that sometimes people think that the Stasi had a file on them, and then they go in and they wait years to get an appointment to go into the library and look, and then they find that there's nothing. And people actually call that, people have file envy. And it's sort of funny, because you can imagine even here, I mean, there's probably people walking around saying, yeah, I was an activist in the 60s and the FBI has a file on me. Well, I mean, they might not, or they might have like tens of thousands of pages on you. The beautiful thing about the Stasi Archive, unlike the FBI, is that you can find out. But I think that's one of the most interesting things about the whole process to us, is the mediation of this information, sort of in the age of WikiLeaks and all these things, like who gets to decide who gets to see what. And it's done very, very carefully. And even we were careful about not further victimizing people through it.
Yeah, and apropos of the age of WikiLeaks, Snowden, the NSA, and so on. What was sort of was there any kind of like a chief insight that you gleaned about this rather strange present we have from in the course of making this film?
Delete your account.
Well, so we did raise the question, like, what would the Stasi do? What would the Stasi do with Facebook? Yeah. And yes, they would probably be happy to have Facebook around and use everyone's information, what is just distributed so freely by everybody. So, I don't know.
But even it was funny coming in on the train today. Ken Bone in 4 days has gone from being Ken Bone, this guy with 270,000 Twitter followers to Ken Bone, someone who looks at pornography clandestinely and, you know, has all these strange obsessions and whatever. And I just think that it's that information, like how we feel about what we share and what we don't share, and the meaning of privacy.
At the same time, though, I think it's really dangerous to mistake the NSA or any of our current government agency watching us with something like the Stasi, because the Stasi was this tool in an oppressive system, in a totalitarian system, and no one could do anything against them. You couldn't speak up against them without danger of being arrested or anything. Here, you can actually actively do something about what's happening with your information, so this should not be mistaken.
Before I turn it over to the audience, I was just curious about one more thing, which was the use of the third person in the voiceover narration. Could you say a bit about what motivated that? Because it's highly personal, and you know you're on screen for much of the film. So could you talk a bit about that?
The voice, yeah, the voice is not my voice. So there are two motivations. One is I was too close to the story, so my voice didn't really work. And then there is when we listened to the Stasi tapes, there was very often a female voice explaining to the Stasi men what they were actually watching, and this inspired us to have this distant voice explaining the things what needed to be explained. So we actually asked our daughter to do the narration because she has a knack for like the announcement in the Berlin subway, like what is the next station. She is good at this. And also there's a certain poetry in the whole thing because she tells the story, like she's the third generation, so she tells the story about her grandfather who she never really met, and I thought it was just very nice.
All right.
Also, she could pronounce everything in German and English perfectly.
We have a question here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. The film is, I'm assuming, a film about being an observer and trusting and informing. In particular, the informers of the Stasi is a negative thing. The trusting is a negative. You don't trust people around you. And yet we're trusting you as filmmakers, as documentarians. And I wonder if you have thoughts about the inversion you did on the word trusting and informing, because you've informed us once again about the Stasi, and you've asked us to trust you.
For those who couldn't hear, it's a question concerning, I guess, the place of the concept of trust, like relative to what you two did as filmmakers here.
That's a very interesting question. As we already heard in the film many times, trust is essential for the functioning of society. I don't know if I necessarily asked you to trust me with my film. You can basically question anything what's in it. I mean, I don't necessarily trust information what is being put in front of me because I know many times it's not necessarily true, or it's not the kind of truth I would seek, which we also find in the Stasi Archive. You know, like there is not the optimal truth. So I don't know if I asked you to trust me. It's more like I asked you to be inspired to maybe not trust all the time, because although we need to trust each other on a certain level, at the same time we need to be aware that it's not possible to trust all the time.
I'm curious where you were and when you started to do this, what were your recollections of where you were when the wall fell? I mean, I was very aware of it, and I know exactly where I was when I saw that the wall was falling, and somebody who lived in Berlin when the wall existed. And it's a very powerful moment to see it go, and it just shattered me. So I'm just curious, before you started the movie, what was your feeling about that experience? And did you remember that you were in the theater there?
For those in the back who couldn't hear, it's a question about where Petra and Michael were when the Berlin Wall came down.
I don't even know where you were. So yes, I do remember the moment very well. That was this gray November day when the wall actually fell, and it was the end of a crazy summer where many of my friends had left East Germany to live in the in the western part of Germany, through Hungary and all kinds of different ways, and there was the assumption I would never see them again. So the moment the wall fell, my first thought was, oh my God, now everyone's gonna leave. I mean, of course, I was also happy that it was gone and that I could also leave potentially if I wanted to, but there was also a certain sadness. No, sadness might be the wrong word, but I was also worried that like everything would completely fall apart, which it did eventually. And the other part of the question about the, what was the other part of the question?
Oh, I was saying,
oh,
how
in the
did you-
theater, yeah, the theater, that was earlier, that was before the wall fell, and I actually did not remember exactly what I did on that day, so the Stasi records helped me to find out, to remember.
I was wondering the experience first of your friend's father and how he related to being interviewed and what that was like, the process of getting him on interviewed. And also for you, it's very interesting to watch your expression and your response during the interview process, and it seemed like you were listening, being very non-judgmental, and I was curious did you think through how you were going to interview people about these subjects in order to get them to speak, and also were you surprised by seeing yourself on camera and your responses?
Okay, so first I will answer that part with my friend's parents who used to work for the Stasi. So they were very reluctant to talk to us on camera first. Because, you know, even today, so their names are not named because even today they are being vilified. And so we met them and she just talked to them, and amazingly, they had never met an American before. And the American is the class enemy, and suddenly they were sitting with the class enemy under their apple tree, and they were overwhelmed, but in a positive way, and on a whim they decided to then suddenly talk to us. And my personal experience with them, I know them since my childhood because they are the parents of my friend. And the whole time I was just afraid that he would have been the one who was actually reporting on my parents or on my family. That didn't happen, but the whole experience was kind of surreal because their living room looked totally similar to my mother's living room. But he was telling me all these things what he used to do in a matter-of-fact way they were completely normal to him. He didn't see what was wrong about what he did. And that was very surreal. At the same time, I tried not to judge him because I know the life in the East was not like just a black and white thing. It was a complex undertaking. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I was curious, in a culture like that, are home movies viewed in a different light? I've noticed in the beginning, for example, you had film shooting of little children walking by, and they were apparently looking at the camera. Were they seeing that as as children? I suppose they were oblivious, but were they knowing that they were under surveillance? There was also that footage of you in the car. When you took that, did the aspect of being under surveillance enter into it at all? I'm just trying to think of these days, of course, now with people with phones taking pictures of each other all the time, what kind of reaction would you have had, 30 years ago?
So most of the footage is, most of it is coming from the Stasi archives. Not all of it is absolutely 100% surveillance. Some of it is propaganda. But one of the most interesting things about the footage is that it is probably one of the only pure records of East German life because some of it is absolutely, no one's aware that they're being filmed. So it has this very interesting documentary ethic to it. At the same time, for us to use the footage, everyone had to be anonymized. Like, say, we couldn't, the children were different because I actually think those children aren't Germans, they're Russians. I think the Russians don't count. There's those very strange rules. We went through like weeks of like, every name had to be bleeped out. People's identities had to be obscured. It's very complex, but it is sort of a funny question because, home movies didn't really exist. There's very little personal footage in the East.
Well, there were home movies, but not like the same amount as in the West, because the material was not available the same way. And the awareness of surveillance in children, I don't know when I started being aware of that the Stasi existed, but it was always present, because I do remember there was a time in the 70s when my parents, you could always watch West German television in East Germany. But there was a time when it was not, when the government didn't like it. And I do remember that we were able to watch it at home, but my parents told us to never talk about it in school. So that these were the first things, and gradually you're aware, you do know that your friends' parents work for the Stasi. They are not in the military, they actually work for this other entity. And eventually you know that whatever groups of people you are in, there are always some people reporting, or at least that was the assumption. So that's a gradual process, but relatively early on you are aware of it.
In the back? Yeah. Hold on, I think they're bringing you a microphone.
First of all, love the film. Thank you so much for being here and showing it to us. I have a question just kind of about the depiction of East Germany in Western culture. I feel like sometimes it's depicted in kind of a fun, kitschy way, like I guess Goodbye Lenin would be in that vein. And actually my stepdad actually grew up in East Germany, and I've talked with him about it, and sometimes he has very fond and warm sort of recollections of growing up in East Germany. But then there's also kind of a more sinister kind of depiction, maybe as in like the lives of others. And I would put your film in that vein as well, where, it's kind of a culture where you can't trust anybody else, and, it's just a very sinister depiction. I'm just wondering if you can reconcile that in any way.
I actually personally liked Goodbye Lenin a lot. It was really funny, and it captured a moment in time really well. Kitschy or not, was just a funny movie. And, life in the East wasn't just like gray and like we all like had our faces hanging long and had no fun. We had normal lives, and we had parties, and we had boyfriends and girlfriends, and it was a complex undertaking. It was not just either or. But at the same time, like all this other oppressive system was present all the time also. So it's like all these things together.
And that question actually raises a point I wanted to discuss with you too, which is apart from the passage about the Eastern German Westerns in the film, the only film that you cite is The Lives of Others. But I was curious whether there are any other renderings of life in East Germany that you had on, like in films that you had on your mind while you were making the film.
It's a difficult question. I never have other movies on my mind when I'm making a film. I don't know. Can you think of anything?
Not really.
Well, there are many movies, but I couldn't really.
It's perhaps an underrepresented thing.
Well, no, there's an issue, but also back to that question, there's the issue about erasure. So this place ceased to exist in 1990, and so how do you remember it? How do you talk about it historically? How do you talk about it culturally? And it's very difficult. There are some fantastic East German films that were done without any real ideology in them that are worth watching, but probably from the outside they're very hard to understand.
I think also many more films should be made about it, because we try to raise the issue about complicity of the ordinary citizens within the system, and that's something that is completely underexplored in general in Germany. So many more films can be made.
Thank you two.
Well, thank you for coming out.